Thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, I know, of course, that these hearings began in KZN. Can you just maybe take us back to why? Because we already have a panel report from a panel that was issued by the president to look into the unrest, and obviously had quite scathing remarks on the security cluster and its response. Why has the Human Rights Commission now gone on to have its own hearings?
Well, good evening, and good evening to everyone watching. And that's a very good starting point, because I guess we need to establish what is the mandate of the South African Human Rights Commission and what is the specific purpose in this instance of these unrest hearings. And simply put, during that particular period, I mean, as you had highlighted, we'd suffered massive economic loss, massive loss of life. But I think that what we can't ignore is the fact that there were also massive human rights violations. And taking us back to the KwaZulu-Natal leg of the hearings, I mean, we've heard of some of those allegations around human rights violations, from restrictions on people's freedom of movement all the way to an infringement, a basic infringement to the right of equality, where people were turned away based on the color of their skin, based on their race, not allowed to enter particular communities. And beyond that, also, you know, torture in some instances. I mean, we've heard some harrowing accounts of what people went through, let alone those people that lost their lives in the process. So I think we cannot ignore, and, you know, going back to the minister's words, the Minister of Trade and, Trade and Enterprise, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't just a perfect storm during that particular period. What we need to also ask ourselves is, what was the human rights environment that gave rise to that particular storm? Why is it that people left their homes and went out on the streets to go break open shops and take as much as they possibly could? In some instances, basic necessities, but in other instances, I think, as we're all aware, there was a high level of criminality. But the fact of the matter is, why is it that so many poor people went out there and took basics such as food, nappies, you know, and those types of items, in an effort to try to alleviate their own poverty during that period? Not to say that that's excusable, but we really have to ask ourselves those questions. So really the South African Human Rights Commission, our mandate in short, is to protect, promote, as well as monitor the attainment of human rights within South Africa. Yeah. And the key question is then looking at the human rights environment that gave rise to what we saw in July, but also then to look at the human rights violations that were committed during the unrest in July.
Just at the face of it, for the riots to even take place, that unrest to take place, surely it speaks to the fact that there's a serious crisis when it comes to human rights in this country.
Indeed, deeply. And I mean, if we look at the socio-economic circumstances within South Africa, where we constantly refer to as being the most unequal state in the world, where we see the high levels of unemployment, and to make matters worse, we sort of emerging out of the ashes of a global pandemic, you know, where, for example, we take things like this for granted, where this is probably the first time I'm in a TV studio in probably 2 years. And this is only possible because of us slowly emerging out of those ashes. But I mean, that had a deep economic impact. It left a lot more people unemployed, it left a lot more people poorer than what they were. And, ultimately we have to ask ourselves, what does it then mean for certain socioeconomic rights that we have, like the right to food? Ultimately we're finding ourselves in a country that seemingly more unequal and poorer. And yes, unfortunately, it becomes a breeding ground for this type of discontent, and where individuals would take the opportunity to take for themselves, maybe not just purely as an act of criminality, but because of need, basic needs.
Yeah. Now, you've talked about harrowing accounts. Can you maybe take us through some of those testimonies that you heard in KwaZulu-Natal in particular that bore the brunt of this unrest?
Well, I mean, not to make any particular judgments, I'm just going to come from, what we've heard from what witnesses had put before us. I mean, a series of roadblocks, for example, was set up in certain communities, and people were most certainly profiled based on race and prevented from entering particular communities. But beyond that, we also saw that there was high levels of racial tension between different race groups. Violence that escalated to murder, violence that escalated to some of the most horrific abuse. Harking back to, the one thing that sticks out to my mind is how one of the witnesses had mentioned that he was told in a particular community that, yeah, this is for our ancestors in 1949 or something to that effect. And you can't help but think to yourself that someone that's probably younger than me, sort of taking vengeance for what happened in 1949. It's deeply disturbing. And I think it speaks to a broader issue for the need for social cohesion within South Africa, whereby, yes, we do have a diverse past. Yes, we have a very painful past. But at some stage, we need to use that past as fuel to try to move ahead as a nation and for us to find some form of cohesion again.
Yeah. Just in terms of the mandate of the Human Rights Commission and the hearings and what you guys can recommend or direct, just how much power do these hearings have in terms of holding those, especially those in power, accountable for what took place in July?
Well, and I'm happy that you sort of distinguishing that, because I think the expert panel, for example, dealt with their findings were based on the executive and executive responsibilities and holding people account at that particular level. It does not mean that when the Commission exercises its mandate that we're not going to hold people to account, whether it's legislative, whether it is at that executive level. But the focus really falls on what the state needs to do in the promotion of human rights and the furthering of human rights. I think that's a better term, the furtherance of human rights. And I think that, we maintain at the South African Human Rights Commission that if we make findings or we make directives and we make recommendations, that those need to be followed through. And if there is, whether it be a state entity, whether it be a private entity, if there's disagreement, if there's unhappiness with regards to whatever decision has been made by the South African Human Rights Commission, you need to take it on review to court. You can't simply ignore it. You can't simply decide not to follow through. And I think the Constitutional Court, albeit through another Chapter 9 institution, has given us that platform, in the judgment on behalf of the Office of the Public Protector, to say that you must adhere to it. Legally and constitutionally, you're compelled to follow the recommendations and follow the directives of Chapter 9 institutions.
Yeah. Now, moving forward, just how much more are the hearings going to take place? I know we're having a couple of more testimonies this week. Who else are we expecting to make their way to the hearings? Can we expect the President himself?
Well, I mean, at this stage, I don't want to go into too many specifics about who is going to appear in front of the, in front of the hearing, because I think one of the key things that also stands out is that we've realized that people are being implicated, institutions are being implicated. So that does obviously open up that space where we can call people in front of the Commission to state their side of the case. Simultaneously, also what levels of responsibility they hold. So I think it would be unfair at this stage to say that these are the people that are coming through, whereas, that list of people could definitely expand. But I mean, going back to your original question, we plan on wrapping up on the 4th of March. That's when, it's due to end. If there is a need for any further testimony after that, we will most certainly alert the general public, as well as through the media in particular. And, to let everyone know that we are going to continue further from there. But one of the key things I can point out is that on Tuesday we will have inspections in loco in either both or one of the two communities that were impacted specifically in Gauteng province, being Soweto and Alexandra. We've heard testimony during the course of last week. And we are expecting senior political officials starting tomorrow to appear before us, because I think the key thing that we need to understand is to what level were people aware of what was going to happen, what were the actions that they took during that particular period, and again, in terms of furthering our human rights, your basic right to freedom and safety of the, freedom and security of the person, as an example. To what extent were the various officials who are responsible for keeping us safe within our communities, within our homes? What action did they take to try to either prevent this or to, at the very minimum, limit it? And those are some of the key questions that we need to see answered.
I noticed last week there was one testimony which was heard in camera. What kind of conditions need to take place for that, for the commissioners to agree to that testimony not being made public?
Well, it's, it happens when there's sensitive information that needs to be shared. And I mean, that could be on multiple levels. It doesn't mean that it only applies to particular individuals or particular institutions. It could be state institutions that can come back and say that, listen, it's either classified information, it's secret information. If it is, out in the public, it might compromise state security, for example. But in this particular instance, we talk about individuals as well that come forward and say, listen, I'd like to give testimony. I'd like to tell the South African Human Rights Commission what happened during that particular period, but for the sake of my own safety, for the sake of the safety of my loved ones and my own community, I'd rather like to, give this evidence in camera. And of course, that, I think we're all well aware that that's legal precedent, where if someone feels that their safety is at risk, that it's not, that it's not safe for them to give evidence of this nature in a public forum and, in the full glare of the general public, that they're able to then provide the evidence in camera.
And when can we expect the report to be made public?
A very popular question. I would hate to commit and say that it will take 3 months, it will take 6 months. What I can say, though, to everyone is that the South African Human Rights Commission takes this extremely seriously, and we would like to get this report out as soon as possible. But I think that we also have to advise that, after the 4th of March, we would have heard 5 weeks of oral evidence. Apart from that, we've also had reams and reams of paper in terms of the written submissions that we've received. Not everyone that has given submissions to the Commission has necessarily appeared in front of the Commission. So all of that has to be ploughed through. The 3 commissioners that make up the hearing panel need to apply their minds. And then subsequent to that, obviously, then the South African Human Rights Commission would be in a position to provide a report with findings, recommendations, as well as directives.
I'd like to just lastly maybe move away from the hearings and focus on the situation we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine. We've got South Africans there struggling to get out. We're hearing reports of possible racism at the borders where Africans are being sidelined. As the Human Rights Commission, we are seeing that our president has been called upon to maybe try and mediate the situation. What would you like to see as a body of human rights, like to see taking place there?
I think the most obvious, and basic observation is that in any state of war, human rights are the last thing to be upheld. You would never see 2 battling sides, take a moment and say that let's observe the human rights of the affected people. I think that, some of the visuals that we've seen just from a basic objective perspective has been quite harrowing. And it's deeply concerning because I think it impacts not just security in that part of the world. It doesn't just impact the human rights of those people affected. It has a global impact. And of course, the sooner we see an end to the conflict, the better it is. Obviously, I would not be as presumptuous as to speak on behalf of the state. The Department of International Relations and Cooperation would need to, decide on what is the best action to take in this instance on behalf of South Africa. But we hope that, that human rights and constitutionalism and international law ultimately is what guides them. As for, the state of people, I think, one of the benefits I've had in my career is having worked with displaced people, whether they be refugees or asylum seekers. And these are very difficult times for any particular state, whether it's, the neighboring states taking people in from the Ukraine. It's very difficult to decide who gets in and who doesn't, because those states are also under pressure and they also have their own citizenry to look after. But simultaneously, there is the humanitarian aspect of it, to assist as many human beings as possible to escape conflict, if not possible death. So it is a very complex and very difficult situation, both on behalf of our own state. And, as soon as we can see a return to peace, the better the situation will be for all.
Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Only
that
pleasure.
is Mr. Gushwell Brooks from the South African Human Rights Commission, giving us a sense of the July unrest hearings, and also giving us his thoughts around the conflict we're seeing in the Ukraine.